Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea's consumer prices in 2019 rose at the slowest pace on record, almost 0%, held down by weak demand and low prices for oil and farm goods. The U.S. and China will reportedly sign Phase 1 of their trade deal in the coming week. That's the message coming from multiple officials at the White House. And North Korea seems to be shifting its interest from the nuclear talks with the United States, instead pledging military countermeasures to ensure its security. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. North Korea's ruling party Central Committee meeting is well into its fourth day today, and there the regime's leader Kim Jong-un seemed to suggest that the North is preparing to endure under international sanctions rather than focus on the nuclear talks with the U.S. Oh Jung-hee reports.
North Korea doesn't seem to be expecting much out of its nuclear talks with the U.S., but is instead preparing to withstand prolonged international sanctions. On Tuesday, Pyongyang's state-run Korean Central News Agency reported that the plenary session of the ruling Workers' Party Central Committee was held for a third day on Monday. Making his report to the party, Kim Jong-un laid out a number of tasks. These include straightening out the regime's economic system and promoting science, education, and public health. Noteworthy is how Kim emphasized the need to prepare, quote, positive and offensive political, diplomatic, and military countermeasures to ensure the regime's sovereignty and security. According to the North Korean report, Kim said the ruling party is determined to go once again on a, quote, long and painful struggle. Kim's main point was that the regime should achieve power and prosperity through independent, self-driven action. Analysts see these statements as showing that Pyongyang has lowered its expectations for better relations with Seoul and Washington. They say the North from now on will focus on achieving economic development on its own and enduring the sanctions. Meanwhile, North Korea's ruling party gathering is continuing for a fourth day on Tuesday. It's the first time since Kim Jong-un rose to power in 2012 that the meeting has lasted multiple days. The gathering is deemed important because it decides the North's future policy directions, and the specific outcomes are likely to be unveiled when Kim Jong-un makes his New Year's address on Wednesday, January 1st. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
And amid the stall in the nuclear talks between Pyongyang and Washington, America's top diplomat says he hopes North Korea will choose the path of peace in the end. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Speaking on Fox News on Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Washington would like to see Pyongyang choose peace and not confrontation, amid expectations North Korean leader Kim Jong-un might announce a new policy toward the U.S. in his upcoming New Year's address. According to Pompeo, Washington is watching developments in Pyongyang very closely, adding the Trump administration's view remains that North Korea's best course of action is to create a better opportunity for the people of North Korea by abandoning its nuclear weapons. Asked whether the U.S. may have to change its North Korea strategy, Pompeo says they're always thinking about whether or not they have the right approach, but will continue on the current path for now. Pompeo seems to have taken a softer approach than U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien on North Korea's threat of further provocations. O'Brien told ABC News a day earlier that the U.S. has many tools in its toolkit to respond to any major provocation and will use them to demonstrate its disappointment. Meanwhile, according to aviation tracker Aircraft Spots, the U.S. flew yet another surveillance aircraft over the Korean peninsula on Monday, amid concerns Pyongyang could launch a long-range missile. The tracker revealed the U.S. RC-135W Rivet joint jet flew over South Korea at an altitude of 31,000 feet. It remains to be seen if the lack of a new proposal from the U.S. ahead of the regime's self-imposed year-end deadline for more flexibility from Washington will cause the North to lash out in frustration. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And the UN Security Council is reportedly due to hold an informal meeting to discuss a draft resolution on easing the sanctions on North Korea. According to Reuters, the meeting comes just a day ahead of the year-end deadline set by the North for the U.S. to show more flexibility in the nuclear talks. It's also the second working-level meeting since China and Russia submitted a resolution a couple of weeks ago calling for the lifting of sanctions on marine products and for North Koreans to be allowed to work in other countries. That resolution, however, is unlikely to pass because the U.S., with its veto, and the EU oppose it. In other news, Iraq was quick to respond to the U.S. airstrikes on its territory on Sunday, which targeted an Iranian-backed militia. It says Washington will have to face consequences for its actions. Yoon Jung-min has the details.
Following U.S. airstrikes on the bases of an Iranian-backed Iraqi militia over the weekend, Iraq warned the U.S. on Monday that its actions will have consequences. According to He's office, Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi condemned the strikes, calling them an unacceptable, vicious assault that will have dangerous consequences. The Iraqi National Security Council said in a statement that the U.S. raids on Iraqi soil would make Baghdad reconsider working with Washington against Islamic State.
The U.S. Defense Minister told me that the U.S. would carry out attacks on bases of Kataib Hezbollah and that this would take place after a few hours. I told him this is a dangerous matter and would escalate tension and we should discuss such affairs. The investigations are still going on about which party carried out the attack on K1 base.
The raids also trigger threats of retaliation from a militia commander who said their response against American forces in Iraq will be very tough. The U.S. military on Sunday conducted airstrikes against positions held by the Kataib Hezbollah militia in the first operation of its kind against that group. At least 25 fighters were killed and 55 were wounded. The strike was in response to the killing of a U.S. civilian contractor in a rocket attack on an Iraqi military base. Iran denies involvement in the attacks on U.S. forces and has condemned the U.S. strikes as terrorism. Tensions with the U.S. have reached new highs since Iran shut down an American drone over the Strait of Hormuz in June, and the attacks Washington says were carried out by Iran on Saudi Arabia's largest oil fields in September. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Tonight, Seoul will be welcoming the new year with an annual bell ringing ceremony downtown at the Bosingak Belfry, and so cars will not be allowed in the area from 10:30 p.m. until 1:30 a.m. All buses passing through the area will be rerouted, but public transportation, including the subway, will operate until 2 a.m. to help people get home. The traditional bell ringing ceremony has been held annually since 1953. 11 bell ringers have been chosen, including the popular YouTube character Pengsu the Penguin and South Korean Major League Baseball pitcher Yoo Hyun-jin, who recently signed with the Toronto Blue Jays. The latest figures from the government show consumer prices in South Korea went up faster than expected in December. But for the whole of 2019, inflation was at the lowest it's been since records began 54 years ago. Kim Hae-sung reports.
South Korea's average consumer inflation in 2019 edged up 0.4% on year, the lowest since Statistics Korea first began compiling related data in 1965. It also marks the third time that South Korea saw consumer inflation below 1% after increases of 0.7% in 2015 and 0.8% in 1999. South Korea experienced low consumer price increases over the past several months, mainly due to lower oil and agricultural goods prices on top of demand-side pressure. Statistics Korea added that government policies of free education and health insurance expansion programs affected inflation growth. By item, agricultural goods prices tumbled 3%, industrial goods prices edged down slightly, with petrochemical goods prices plunging 6%. Electricity, water, and gas prices increased 1.5%, while services prices rose nearly 1%. Figures released Tuesday also show consumer prices in December went up 0.7% on year, rising for the second consecutive month after falling for the first time in September. Core inflation that excludes food and energy prices went up 0.7% in 2019, the lowest rise in around 2 decades. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
South Korean companies' business outlook in December has improved from last month's. According to the Bank of Korea, the Business Survey Index for all industries came to 76 for December, up 2 points on month. Despite that slight increase, the reading is still below 100, meaning companies are still pessimistic about the local economy. Weakness in electronics kept the index for manufacturing the same at 74, despite a better performance in semiconductors and better prospects for the sector. The index for non-manufacturing increased 3 points to 78 on rising demand for construction. The head of South Korea's central bank says the bank will stick with its accommodative monetary policy in the coming year. In a New Year's speech on Tuesday, Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol said inflationary pressure on the demand side is expected to remain weak in 2020. In order to use monetary policy effectively and at appropriate times, he pointed out the importance of analyzing and predicting economic flows. He added that by using IT and expanding economic indicators, forecasting can be made more accurate. He also called on the government and financial authorities to do their utmost to closely monitor possible instability in foreign exchange markets and maintain the country's financial stability through market stabilization. Many companies in South Korea plan to reduce the number of job openings to the lowest level in 10 years. A Labor Ministry report shows local firms with 5 or more regular employees plan to hire a total of around 250,000 people between October this year and this coming March. This is a reduction of 40,000 new hires and a dip of about 13% on year. The Korean stock market lagged far behind many other global markets this year, but foreign investors did make money overall. According to the Korea Exchange, 8 out of the top 10 stocks that were net bought by foreign investors in 2019 made them profits. Samsung Electronics was the most sought-after stock and was up 44% for the year. Foreign investors net bought over $860 million of local shares in 2019, with their holdings accounting for 38.4% of market cap on the main bourse, up nearly 3 percentage points from last year. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this New Year's Eve, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, thank you as always for coming on today.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, the rally on Wall Street couldn't go on forever, of course, and stocks were down on Monday. They'll be trading, though, on New Year's Eve, unlike Korea. What's the story today in the global markets?
Sure. As you said, the overall market did some correction. That's because of such a strong movement that occurred over the last several months. If you look at the year-to-date numbers, Dow was up 22.01%, and S&P is up 28.5%, and NASDAQ is up 35%. And just the 1 month period, last 1 month, most of these indices were up anywhere between 2.5% to 4.5%. So that's why we needed some correction. If you look at one of the major indicators in terms of the sentiment, the fear and greed index, that numbers are coming in well above 90, which is a very, very greedy period, and therefore we needed some correction. If you look at some of the sectors that did correction in yesterday's market movement were the bio sector and IT sector, and also one of the major, developing market called Argentina. And if you look at most of these indices as well as the sectors, they corrected more than 1.5% or so. We think that was needed in order for the market to further go up in the future in a longer-term basis. But in the short term, you need some technical correction in order for the better next year.
Right. Well, in the new year, in the first week of it, the U.S. and China are expected to sign phase 1 of their trade deal. That's priced into the outlook for equities next year, of course. But what's your outlook for Korean stocks, and what in particular should we be watching?
Right. As you said, most of that positive news will probably apply to most of the global equity market. But as for the Korean equity market, we think that might have a more positive implication in the future. Because if you look at the Korean equity market, year to date, it is only up by 7.67%. And if you look at the last 3 years of performance, Korean Kospi is up only 8.45%, so barely moved in the last 3 years. The reason for that is because of the Korea's long-term prospect. and economic growth rate have slowed down to 2% territories. And also the global factors, the global economic growth rate also slowed this year. So as being a very export-oriented country, the earnings growth were not good this year. That has affected negatively. However, though, if the trade deals are made, then the overall export numbers should recover. If that's the case, the earnings for the Korean company should recover as well. And because of that, we think that the next year's prospect could be positive. Hopefully, we will see a global economic recovery happening next year from current 3% territories to 3.5%. If that actually occurs, then that will be definitely positive news for Korean equity market.
Well, zooming out a little bit, on the macro level, we saw consumer prices in Korea rising at the slowest pace since records were first compiled in 1965. If this goes on, there are concerns about deflation. Do you think there'll be a recovery in that regard in 2020?
I really hope so, but the numbers are not looking that good. If you look at, as you said, in November, the inflation numbers gained only 0.2%. And in December, it did recover somewhat, but it's only up by 0.6%, which is well below 1% territories. And also the target inflation rate of 2% is not met. The main reason for that is because Korean equity markets' long-term prospect is slowing, particularly if you look at the consumers. If you look at the consumers' overall loan as a percentage of GDP hit as high as 93% territories. If that's the case, then consumers probably cannot consume as aggressively as before. If that's the case, then deflationary pressure could actually happen. So what we have to depend on is what's happening to the export. If you look at the export numbers, it was down quite significantly by almost two-digit growth rate negative. If hopefully that should recover in the future. Also, even though the currency has depreciated much, inflation numbers are coming in such timid, that means that domestic demand is very weak. Hopefully, global economic growth rate should have positive trigger effect to the domestic consumption. Hopefully, that should have some stabilization to prices. And if that's the case, then equity markets should do okay in the future. But nevertheless, as you said, there is concern about deflationary pressure. We need a much more aggressive monetary and fiscal policy from the government.
All right, Mr. Yu, that'll have to be our last conversation for 2019. Thanks so much for coming on every week, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year.
And as we just discussed, it looks like the trade deal between the U.S. and China will be signed in the coming week. That's what officials in the White House have been suggesting. Kim Yo-sun has this report.
It looks like Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will visit Washington this weekend to sign a Phase 1 trade deal with the U.S. Citing unnamed sources, the South China Morning Post reported Monday that Washington sent an invitation and Beijing accepted. The article also explained that the Chinese delegation led by Liu is expected to stay in the U.S. for a few days until the middle of next week. Neither Beijing nor Washington has officially confirmed the trip. Against this backdrop, President Trump's trade advisor Peter Navarro told Fox News on Monday that Washington is expecting a deal to be signed within the next week or so. He added that the two sides are waiting for the translation. The remarks by Navarro, who is a leading China hawk within the White House, signals that the signing of the deal is likely imminent. Earlier this month, U.S. Trade Chief Robert Lighthizer and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said the signing of the preliminary trade deal will take place in early January. However, as President Trump explained last week that he and Chinese President Xi Jinping will have a signing ceremony to sign the Phase 1 trade deal, it's left to be seen when the leaders will officially seal the deal. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Relations between South Korea and Japan deteriorated badly this year over issues of history. The result was friction in their trade relations and even in defense and security. But as our Kim Min-ji reports, these tensions started to ease in recent weeks.
Hopes were high that the Christmas Eve summit between President Moon Jae-in and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe would provide much-needed momentum for the two sides to patch up their brittle relationship. Despite their differences over history and trade, the two leaders agreed to meet more often and not leave the situation unaddressed.
일본과 한국은 지리적으로 역사적 문화적으로 가장 가까운 이웃이자 그 역사 인적 교류에서도 매우 중요한 통행 번영의 동반자입니다. 잠시 불편한 일이셔도 결코 멀어질 수 없는 사이입니다.
I also hope to develop the important Seoul-Tokyo relationship and exchange honest views.
It was a step in the right direction given that bilateral relations took a sharp turn for the worse this year. Japan stripped South Korea of its preferential treatment and export procedures, on top of imposing tougher restrictions on the export of 3 high-tech materials. Tokyo cited a breach of trust and security issues, but Seoul saw it as retaliation for the compensation issue of Japan's wartime forced labor. South Korea hit back by taking Japan off its own trade whitelist and decided to withdraw from a joint military intel sharing pact known as JSOMIA. But there were efforts along the way to build bridges. South Korea's Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon visited Tokyo to attend the enthronement ceremony of the new Japanese emperor, while Moon and Abe had brief talks on the sidelines of the ASEAN meeting in Bangkok. Such events, coupled with behind-the-scenes diplomacy, bore fruit. 6 hours before JSOMIA was set to expire, South Korea decided to conditionally put off its decision to withdraw, with Japan agreeing to resume talks over their trade dispute. Since then, a round of talks have been held between the two sides, while Tokyo has relaxed export restrictions for one of the 3 materials it had put under tighter control.
It's a positive sign that the two sides have started to talk, but the trade issue will take some time to solve, and to put Seoul back on Tokyo's trade whitelist will require the approval of Japan's cabinet. That said, South Korea will also put JSOMIA back on the table.
But even if progress is made on that front, experts say the key will be whether they can find a fundamental solution to their historical dispute that's acceptable to both governments and the victims. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Korean smartphone makers have decided to extend their warranties for free repairs from 1 year to 2 years for their local customers. According to reports citing industry sources, that's effective for newly bought phones starting New Year's Day. If a phone cannot be repaired, then it'll be replaced or the customer will get a refund. For laptops, free mainboard repairs will be also extended to 2 years. However, warranties for batteries, chargers, and earphones will stay the same at 1 year. The year 2020 is a leap year, meaning it'll have 1 extra day in February. Unfortunately, there are fewer days off work in the new year compared to this year, but with a little bit of planning, you can maximize your time off. Our Kim Jae-hee has the details.
Because 2020 is a leap year, there'll be an extra day added on February 29th. This means a total of 366 days to keep the calendar lined up with the sun and the seasons. But 2020 will also have fewer days off work. There'll be a total of 115 weekend days and holidays. Compared to 2019, that's 2 fewer days off work because a number of public holidays fall on the weekend. The Independence Movement Day on March 1st falls on a Sunday, and Memorial Day on June 6th is a Saturday, and National Liberation Day on August 15th is also on Saturday. However, with planning, there are some chances to take an extended break. For example, the 5-day Chuseok holiday starts on Wednesday, September 30th and ends on Sunday, October 4th. The following Friday, October 9th, is Hangul Day. If you take 4 days off in between, you can have a break 12 days long. There's another chance in April. Buddha's birthday is on Thursday, April 30th, and Children's Day is the following Tuesday, May 5th. So if you take off a couple of days and join them up with the weekend, you'll have a break of 6 days in a row. But one of the country's biggest holidays, the Lunar New Year or Seoll날, won't yield as many days off as usual. Because it falls on a weekend, the government has designated an extra holiday on Monday, but even still with the weekend, the break is only 4 days long. So if you want to maximize your time for vacations in 2020, it might be good to start planning now. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news at 7 p.m. and Arirang's New Year's special coming up this evening.